Nico.
Hey there.
Thanks for making time to come on the show. Why don't you take a second to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Necko Fanning. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a corporate DEI leader and cultural organizational change manager. I've been working in DEI and advocacy for about 10 years.
Wonderful, wonderful. When um, the last 10 years, right? DEI has changed a bit.
Yeah, just a bit.
Yeah. What have you noticed that has changed, and what are employees needing from folks like us in the workplace these days?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've noticed kind of some yo-yoing effects. I'm sure that current climate and whatnot probably lends to that. But workplace expectations have really changed pretty dramatically. Namely, the research that we do have available to us has shown that um, leaders are coming to realize that if they want the best from their employee population, they really have to have satisfied, safe, diverse teams that are ultimately going to yield the best results and more innovative results. So I think employers specifically and leaders are seeing that, the grind doesn't really work, it doesn't get the best results, and it's really about thinking through how can you create an environment for your employees that allows everyone to bring their full selves to work.
Yeah. When you say safe, right? I mean, there's that like kind of operational safety, physical safety, but are you referring to the broader sense of like more psychological safety?
Yeah, there is a level of psychological safety, but there's also that level of practicality as well. There was some interesting research that came out that said that depending on where headquarters was located, female identifying employees might be less likely to work on site for that organization because they felt less safe going to their cars at night if they had to leave when it was dark. So it goes beyond even just psychological safety and really thinking about the holistic welfare of the employee from the second that they wake up in the morning and start their commute either digitally or virtually or physically into the office, from the moment that they leave the office to go back home or to disconnect from their computer. So their psychological safety, their physical safety, their
Mhm.
operational safety, it's kind of an all-encompassing broader sense, I guess.
Interesting. Yeah, it seems like a natural connection to all of that. If you're worried about being attacked on your way to the car or to and from work, it's definitely going to impact what you're able to bring to the table that day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, I've seen a shift in some cases where we've got inclusion and belonging, and we want people to feel like they can bring the parts of their life to work that they want. Um, I've seen a move that pulls in a little bit more like mental well-being into that. Do you have any thoughts on why those are starting to seem like a closer and more connected offering to folks at work?
Yeah, I think two things. One, I think the pandemic really highlighted how important it is for employers to be ready and able, not just to have resources for employees, but to
Mhm.
activate those resources and have leaders who are able to support employee mental health. I think we saw during the pandemic just a mass decline in mental health as we were all self-isolating and we were all quarantining. So it's really important for employers to be able to do that. From the DEIB's leader perspective of it, we know that there's an intersectional focus that happens with employee wellness and employee mental wellness. If you have all employees of one group, and externally something's going on in the media or something's going on in the world or legislation's been passed. I mean, if we just think about the queer population very specifically and narrowly, it can be really difficult for employees to focus on their job when they're feeling attacked outside of the work that they're doing by a state or an administration or legislation that's being passed. So I think DEIB and DEI in general are really trying to pull that to the forefront to show that employers can support employees during those difficult times, even if they can't necessarily go and change that legislation themselves.
Mm. Yeah, boy, you said it. Portions of the queer community are definitely under attack, and if your whole existence is being sort of tagged as offensive or not right, like we're seeing with some of our trans uh, cohort folks within in workplace. I can imagine it would be hard to bring your full self to work when your healthcare, your access to anything is being impeded, your job, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
It brings up kind of the element of trust, right? So when a work um, place, right, they want to take care of you, they want to get the best out of you. You ultimately want to do that as well. There's these challenges. How big of a factor does like trust play when it comes to like having employees be engaged?
Trust is probably, and I have a theme with some of the work that I'm doing right now. I put a lot of emphasis on leaders when we talk about trust. Trust is probably one of the most foundational and oft overlooked aspects of DEI. I really like to use the Francis Fry trust model to talk about this. Francis Fry is this incredible researcher, and they present this idea that trust rests kind of in a triangle. So there's kind of three sides to it.
Okay.
There's authenticity, empathy, and logic. And if one of those spaces, authenticity, empathy, or logic, is not on solid footing between two or more groups of people, then you get what's called a wobble in your trust triangle. I really appreciate that analogy because I think when you chat with leaders about empathy, authenticity, and logic, especially our C-suite leaders, our executives, the first thing that they're surprised by is that logic is the only, hard skill that they can focus on. Authenticity and empathy are probably two things that they don't prioritize as highly as logic. And
Hmm.
so it really highlights, I think, for leaders that you can be as logical as you want. You can make these great, intuitive leaps for the organization. But if you're a leader who doesn't emphasize being authentic or emphasize being empathetic within the workplace, then you're not galvanizing your employees. And really, trust is about making sure that people feel as if they have the space to be as innovative and creative and solution driven as possible within the workplace. So it really should be foundational to particularly leaders when they're designing their programs and strategies.
Yeah, like when you think of if you're going to be innovative and you're going to maybe offer a new solution, that is coming at the hands of challenging or deconstructing or tearing down an existing solution, right? And changing that
Really.
status quo. If you're also an outsider, feeling like an outsider, and you don't have that safety or that trust, like what is it going to take for you to challenge the status quo and surface your idea, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think, and again, that's why I go back to leadership because it's much easier for employees to feel trust amongst one another, but that trust can also be on the basis of distrust for other people, right? Like it can be, I trust you because we share the same view that we're both really irritated with leadership, and it creates kind of an us-them effect. So it's so important for leaders to create
Okay.
trust-driven spaces.
Right. So if they see a leader acting inauthentically, illogically, they might form a trusting bond to their people because of they're like, oh, we've got to deal with this leader. That would be in the wrong way, I guess.
Right, right.
Hmm. Um, so I guess that logical thing, I'm thinking about like fairness, right? That seems to be a pretty big disruptor of engagement that is like along or adjacent to what we're talking about. You know, when we think about what employees are up against, like what is fairness in access to growth and opportunity and like a fair workplace? What does that look like?
Yeah, oh my gosh. This is one of the topics that I could probably spend quite some time on. This is a
Okay.
great one. I think I'll speak about two that are really important though when it comes to fairness. Again, this really goes back to leadership as well. And firstly, I think succession planning is really, really important.
Okay.
Leaders need to take the time to identify potential successors to their roles and other roles, and then they need to share these with their HR teams and appropriate leadership. The idea is that you want to formalize those potential mentorship roles to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to engage in who the next person coming up into that role might be, but also that that leader can convey their logic behind why they want someone stepping into the role. I think succession planning is something that is on the bottom of most leaders' lists of things that they want to do for any role, let alone for their own role or for other senior roles. And really, if we think about some of the most disruptive times within an organization, it's when we have leaders who need to change over. It's when we have leaders coming or going. It's when you're trying to get a new leader onboarded to learn the company and also create, a new system or create an innovative roadmap for the team that they've just taken over. So I think succession planning, I beg your pardon, is really important. It also focuses the laser of who's going to step into the next role internally and creates internal growth within an organization, as opposed to if a leader leaves and people don't feel as if they've been grooming somebody to step into those roles, they might feel that they need to look outside of the company. So I think that's really, really important. Um, Secondly, and I probably can't stress this enough, but we need to stop using performance reviews
Mm,
and setting arbitrary percentages for those performance reviews. This isn't good HR and this isn't good DEI by any means. I think we've all seen it where someone will say you need to give a rating between 1 and 5, but only 30% of your team is allowed to have a 5 rating. And it's like, well, that makes no sense, right? Because that means that you're inherently saying that only 30% of your team, regardless of how they actually performed, are deserving to be recognized for their work. So these arbitrary percentages really prevent people from advancing. And unfortunately, we see that they inject a lot of bias and unfairness into the process. And people of color, employees of color, namely, are usually the ones that suffer.
mm. I thank you for bringing that up. That entire feedback and for performance management process has a lot of problems. Now, I understand that they need some type of data to make these decisions on, but to then put a tax, it's a demotivator, right? In this
Absolutely.
scenario, like for me, if I'm looking to develop myself, and get the most high rating, etc., I would then try to place myself on a very low performing team and outshine everybody versus being on a team of all high performers because it gets skewed that way.
Absolutely. And it also creates this, again, it doesn't facilitate the building of trust within the organization or between managers and employees. Because if I'm doing a fantastic job and my goal is to rise within the ranks of the company, but I know that a manager has, employees that they're trying to keep at the organization because they're very high performing themselves and they're ready to leave the organization. And they're getting consistent 5s while doing, work that I might not necessarily see as 5 level work. It just creates the system of who got what and why, as opposed to I got what I deserved. And I got it because of the work that I did and not because I did a fantastic job, but I wasn't as important to keep at the organization as somebody else. So I think, performance management and setting arbitrary percentages for those, especially when we're talking about ratings, it's detrimental to a lot of employee growth. And again, we have research that shows us that employees of color are usually the ones that suffer.
Yeah, so leaders, I'm guessing, naturally will have blind spots to how they view the performance of others, especially when there's a lot of difference. They may naturally favor and uplift those that maybe remind them of their style and their experience. So if you have a leadership team that looks one way, as they're selecting mentors or looking for succession, what could you put in place so that they don't automatically just with good intentions naturally create the same lack of different approaches to leadership and experience?
Yeah, so a couple of things we can do is one of the things that I've noticed is most helpful is to put it in front of people. And so working with your data analysts or with your people analytics teams, it's really important to pull that data and put it in front of leaders and say, hey, look, The last five people that you hired and or promoted all looked and came from the same background and went to the same school. So that's problematic. We need to think about how we can work with you to adjust your thinking on bringing more innovative folks in. Um, Beyond that, it goes back to formalizing some of those relationships. So when you have the opportunity to either bring people into the organization or advance people currently within the organization via committee, what we actually notice is that people tend to be a little more fair because unfortunately, you're more worried about what the people to your left, right, and center are thinking about you in terms of who you're hiring. So you tend to be a little more self-critical of your choices. So ultimately, if you are somebody who wants to make sure that you're hiring more diverse candidates, you're somebody who's hiring a broader wealth of experience and backgrounds, or promoting those folks, it's important to make sure that you aren't doing it in a silo and that you're getting advice from outside of just you or just your team or even just your leadership team, and really asking a broad range of people to participate either in the hiring or the promotional process.
I think that's great because then it surfaces the personal accountability that everyone has and the commitments and alignment to the company culture, the company vision, and their way of operating. I think that's wonderful. Any tips or thoughts on how a system for performance development or like a rating like that we talked about? Is there something that could be done that's better that doesn't create that lack of trust?
Yeah, again, honestly, it's silly because it's a simple solution, but getting rid of percentages is
Okay.
the most important things. Get rid of the quotas completely. Don't ask your managers to do that. Um, Again, by getting rid of those percentages, you don't create a competitiveness, and people are more likely to judge people's performance more honestly if they don't feel that they have to pit their employees against each
Mm.
other to decide who gets what. And we noticed that that's one of the reasons that lots of employers impose percentages is because they'll look at teams and say, look, you gave like out of 10 people, you gave six or seven of them a five. That's just too many. Like they can't all be overperforming. Well, yeah, they can, right? Like they absolutely can. And to say that they can't be is because you want to make sure that, you're creating these false systems of whether or not someone has the right rating to get promoted in this next promotional cycle, just discourages employees. If you can be more open and honest and say, you did a fantastic job, you got a five, we want you to stay at the organization. But, unfortunately, we're just not as a company at the right growth to promote you right now. That's a more honest stance. And I think employees appreciate that. They might not like it. It might not align with their personal goals moving forward, but they're much less likely to leave the company angrily than they are to say, well, I'm going to start kind of looking other places, but I'm not going to negate or neglect the work that I'm doing here because at least I'm being treated fairly.
Mm. Yeah, that would be nice. I would like to see that. I think performance management is a pain point for everyone. I think receiving feedback, especially if you're assessing that maybe your leader has a blind spot or comes from a culture that's very different from yours, that you might have a collectivist kind of consensus building nature that may never be seen as a leader, by the current boss. So
Right.
there's so many challenges. Yeah, I wanted to shift gears a little bit, right? So
Yeah.
as we look forward, right, we know there's so many disruptions. We've got the external politics and culture. People are feeling some churn around like downsizing and restructuring. And artificial intelligence is impacting how and what humans do at work. Are there any things that you would say should be adopted to future-proof a company?
Yeah, stand by your commitments, I think is, and I'm laser focused speaking to leadership here again, stand by your commitments. That's the literary nerd in me wants to break down the word commitment. It's a powerful word and organizations use it very willy-nilly. if we look at what just happened with DEI recently, we're seeing organizations who have said for 5, 10 years that they stand by these commitments, they stand committed to certain demographics of people, and then they've let much of those programs go with the first sign of any resistance. So I think if you are a small to mid-sized company that has decided to pull back on DEI, I would warn you to look at other companies, both medium and large, that have suffered from boycotts and revenue dips in the last 6 to 12 or 6 to 8 months. Target, I think, unfortunately, I adore Target, but I think that, they're kind of they're kind of the what is the word I'm looking for?
Canary in the coal mine. Don't.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
The story that we tell to warn one another, they're parable. It's worrisome. So I would say if you make a commitment, you need to stand by that commitment. You need to have an authentic and strategic plan to execute on that commitment. It can't be performative. And you need to understand leaders and organizations what that word means, because if you scale back those commitments because they're challenged, people are going to ask you why you made the commitment to begin with. And if you try to make it again in the future, people are going to be much less likely to believe you. So um, be prepared for repercussions, stand by your commitments, be ready to advocate for the people that you have made promises to and said that you believe deserve a fair shake at work within your organization.
yeah, yeah. That it seems so simple, but it is so powerful. And I just want to acknowledge too that this is a really complex environment. So it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
necessarily an easy lift, especially if you're under certain grant money or you're connected to government and you need to make these changes, or else there won't be a business to make more inviting to employees. It might go. So I just want to appreciate that aspect, that it is a little bit more complicated of a game these days, but I agree, a commitment's a commitment. And if we're following that trust triangle, I think an answer of, hey, just acknowledging the times have changed. And yes, we made this commitment, we are still committed, but we have to, you know, dance around a little bit while we're figuring out the new normal. Because I think there's a lot of feelings of betrayal at work that require a lot of extra effort to kind of get back to a place of feeling like, this is a great place to work. This is for me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that there's just a level of kind of outrage to see companies who
Mm.
say we have to scale back on DEI because we're afraid of losing those government contracts or losing those grants. And then, the next week they post that they've had record-breaking revenue. You can't have it both ways. And people
Right.
acknowledge those, employees acknowledge that, people who consider working for your company see that, and they know that that's not necessarily a company that they can trust moving forward. And so even if they do end up onboarding into that company, that kind of red alarm is kind of flashing in the back of their minds to be wary of what happens next. So I think companies really need to learn to stand by their commitments if they're going to make them.
You have culture change management in your background. And I'm wondering if you've seen some of the things that I've seen in my experience, right? So you have a company, they put out a very strong statement for inclusion. You have an executive layer that is usually, relationship based and smooth talking and really understands that mission and can really drive home the importance, and they're really smooth about it, right? They know, they can read the room, they can speak to this in a really engaging way. A company's trying to like align everybody to that. But when you get to that middle level management team who maybe didn't necessarily buy into this, wasn't necessarily aligned, and now given this new marching orders, so to speak, or new ways of doing the work that they'd always done. I've seen that it kind of starts to fall apart there because there's a lot of emotional labor required to do this work if you're shifting inside, or if you're growing to a new view of others and how you work with them. Have you seen anything similar, and any suggestions on how, if so, if how you would address it?
Yeah. And again, I feel like I'm picking on leaders right now. I feel so bad. But really, it does go back to leadership. And, the first part of what you said is leaders are usually able to talk the talk, but
Yeah.
rarely do I see them walk the walk. If in many instances where I've worked with executives, pretty much every instance, I wouldn't say every, but a lot of instances that I've worked with executives,
Mm.
if I ask them why are we doing this, it's like deer in the headlights. It's,
Okay.
they understand, they feel as if they themselves have been told we need to do this because it's important. We need to do this because it'll help the company. But when you ask them, why are we doing this program? Like what is the benefit to the organization that we're going to get? It's crickets, right? They'll go back to those kind of fluffy talking points that they memorized with their PR team and with their with us DEIB folks in the room helping them, kind of sort through that. But if you want those middle managers to take it seriously, to actually feel as if it's connecting back to the work that they're doing, then your leadership needs to be able not just to say it once in a quarterly review or once every 6 months that DEI is important. This is our 10-minute talking point. Make sure you do your DEI annual training, and that's all that the leader talks about, unless directly confronted with a question. It has to be a part of their everyday strategy. When you're stepping in to ask somebody about your one-on-ones, in addition to saying, what do your numbers look like? What revenue did you generate? What issues did you have? How's your team going? You have to ask, how are you doing executing against these goals that I gave to you? And leaders are often afraid to do that because they're afraid of the questions that are going to be asked by those managers, right? If I'm giving you a goal that I don't quite understand myself, I'm sure
Right.
shit not going to be like, asking you questions about it because I don't want you to ask me all these questions that I can't answer. And so leaders have to get more competent. They have to get more proficient in being able to answer these questions, have these conversations. They need to be less reliant upon their comms teams to do it for them and their
Ooh,
PR teams and their DEI folks. And they actually have to take the time to learn these skills themselves and make sure that they are imparting that knowledge to their managers and their managers to their managers. It's a trickle down effect, and it really does
yeah.
start at the top.
Yeah. And I know a lot of this weight has been on leaders. I don't necessarily feel you're picking on leaders, but I do want to say that a lot of leaders have the right intention. And unfortunately, sometimes that impact isn't aligned with that intention. And when that surfaces, that the impact is different what they intended, that's where there's a churn because it's either fear or like it's high stakes, right? We see people get canceled for saying the wrong thing all of the time. And I think leaders want to be efficient and they want to do what's right unless it's really hard or can lead to them being worse off themselves or whatever. But we don't have a lot of venues or even the savvy or the language to handle this level of conflict out in the open on teams that often. Have you ever seen a team handle conflict or challenge leadership in that way and come out better for it?
I have. I've noticed more empathetic leadership over the years than than we've had, 10 years ago or so. Um, I'll be honest that I do notice a trend of leaders starting to prioritize empathy as an important aspect of their leadership skills. The the most success that I've seen with companies is creating DEI councils or advisory councils
Okay.
to leadership who can then kind of reflect policies back to the leaders and say, like, look, this is our take on how it was received within the organization. Employee satisfaction surveys, we have to all do them like what, 2 or 3 times a year now. And we think that they've always existed, but they didn't really. This is employee satisfaction thing, surveying is something that's actually pretty new within a lot of corporations, but it does provide a lot of data, and leaders do lean on that data. Um, Depending on their leadership style, how they do that is up to them. But they do lean on that data to say, are there changes that I need to make to my leadership style, or we as a leadership team need to make together moving forward? So I've noticed surveying and councils, ERGs, employee resource groups, are another fantastic resource for this. They're usually there's usually a strong relationship built with leadership and ERG, at least co-chairs or leaders themselves. They tend to develop that relationship. And I strongly encourage ERG leaders to make sure that they do develop those relationships so that they can casually message their leader and be like, hey, Bob so and so, this policy you put out is a little wonky. I think, this line kind of reads a little misogynistic. Hey, do you think we can adjust it to this? And leaders do respond to that, and leaders are quick to action on those items. So developing relationships is really important as well.
Relationships built on trust is the through line, I think, for all of this conversation that we've been having. It's been a wonderful discussion, Necko. I feel like you and I could go deep on these things for much longer than the time that we have for today. I really want to thank you for making time and sharing your wisdom with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was so great. I adore working on and chatting on these topics. So thanks so much for pulling me up to chat about them.